Good morning and welcome to EPC online policy discussion on women in peace and security. What can the EU and NATO do better? My name is Ionela Ciolan and I'm a research fellow in the Europe in the World program here at EPC. And this is my first event as a moderator, so I'm really excited that today we have together three brilliant women representative from UN Women, European External Service Action Service and NATO. And some technicalities before starting. If you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A button to write your question there in the chat. Or if you, and when writing your question, please write it in a clear and concise manner. Or if you'd like to ask the question directly, please use the raise hand button and my colleagues will give you the opportunity to ask the question in the Q&A part of our event. Happy to have you all here today. We're discussing one of the topics which is very dear for me, women in international security. Women and men are affected differently by conflict, war, and violence. They also perceive insecurity differently. And statistics are showing that women are often excluded from formal peace negotiations, which no longer perspective may have devastating consequences on how we can reach a sustainable peace and human security. 21 years ago, on 31 October 2000, UN Security Council adopted the UN Resolution 1325, or as we mostly know it, Women, Peace and Security Agenda. This was a landmark resolution because it recognizes the importance of a gender perspective on peace and security. And for the first time, it called on the member states of the United Nations and above all parties to conflicts to protect the rights of women and involve women as equals on a level playing field in peace negotiations, conflict resolution, and reconstruction. Essentially, at the heart of the resolution, there are the three P's: participation of women in peace processes, prevention of wars, and protection against gender-specific violence. So today, a closer look at the resolution 1325, it's needed. And as human rights and gender equality are also European values, and the European Union launched in 2018 the EU strategic approach to women, peace and security, we also have a speaker that will present us more about what the European Union does in this subject. And also we have a speaker from NATO because the alliance also it's involved in applying and discussing more about the role of women in the peace and security processes in its 2030 agenda. So for today's discussion, basically what we'll do, we'll try to assess the current state of the UN resolution on women, peace and security, look at the level of implementation, what worked well, what should be changed both in the European Union and NATO's implementation of the agenda. And moreover, we're also debating what are the gender strategies, policies, or programs does both the European Union and NATO have to include more women voices in the decision-making processes in defense and security. Together with us, we have three distinguished female leaders and glass ceiling breakers in their field. I will give you a brief presentation of each of them before starting to question them about this topic. So we have Madam Charlotte Isaksson, which is the Senior Gender Advisor at the European External Action Service. And she was, among other things, the pen holder of the EU a strategic approach to the women, peace and security and its action plan. She has also quite a lot of experience working as a gender advisor for the Light Command Operation NATO and SHAPE in Belgium in the past years, and also for the Swedish Armed Forces Headquarters and other international organizations. We also have the honor to have Madam Alia El-Yassir. I hope that I pronounced correctly your name. She's the regional director of the UN Women in Europe and Central Asia. She has more than 20 years working for the United Nations, and she previously worked for the UN Women Special Representative in the occupied Palestinian territories on different and complex portfolio, including programs and projects related to tackling gender equality and women empowerment issues in different countries around the world. We also have Lieutenant Colonel Diana Morais. She is the chair of the NATO Committee on Gender Perspective. NATO Committee on Gender Perspective was established in 1976 and is one of the oldest committees inside the alliance. This is an advisory body of the Military Committee of NATO who promotes gender perspective in the alliance military operations and the implementation of the United Nations resolution in this area. So as you see, we have the best panelists for this discussion, and I'm grateful that they took their time to be together with us today. And I would like to start with Madam El-Yassir, and I would like to ask her to give us a brief presentation of the UN Resolution 1325, because probably not all of our audience is very familiarized with this resolution. So, Madam El-Yassir, what conclusion can you draw after 21 years of the resolution 3025? What is at the heart of this resolution? Who is responsible for implementing it? And what successes have been achieved by the resolution so far?
Thank you so much, Ionela, and good morning, Lotta. Nice to see you again. And Lieutenant Colonel, nice to meet you. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever colleagues are joining from. And it's really, I'm super pleased to be participating in the event today. What I understand is we're looking at our progress against, in terms of implementation against this landmark resolution on women, peace and security. And we're asking ourselves, what can the EU and NATO, and I would say beyond that, all of us, what can we do better? I think the adoption of this landmark resolution by member states of the United Nations in 2000 really fundamentally changed the image of women in conflict situations and moved it from an image of passive victims of the conflict to that of active participants. We started to see them more globally. I would say the advocates who brought about the resolution always saw it that way, but I think the global community started to shift their focus and see women as agents for positive change, as peacemakers, peace builders, negotiators. I think you talked about the 3 Ps of the resolution, and I think there's a 4th pillar, which is on relief and recovery. But what I'd like to focus on very much is participation. Because I see it really as a key and foundational pillar. It's cross-cutting, and it really, without it, you're not going to be able to implement the aspirations of this agenda, and it has an impact across the board. It speaks to the participation of women in peace processes, in conflict resolution and reconciliation, as well as in conflict prevention to begin with. Women's participation is also really essential for making sure that women's needs and interests are fully reflected in protection efforts, as well as in the relief and recovery periods in the aftermath of a conflict. And we have seen progress in this area, but not really nearly enough, and we really can do better. So now we're 21 years after the adoption of this landmark resolution. It's the first one. It's not the only resolution. There have been other resolutions since then. But to mark the 20th anniversary last year, the UN Secretary General produced a report and really emphasize that there has to be a radical shift in the meaningful participation of women in peace and security efforts. And I think we really need to reflect on this in terms of what is this radical shift, and to move the thinking beyond just numbers and really think about what does it mean to have meaningful participation. I will touch on the numbers a little bit as well. This report really recommends that the leaders across countries and also organizations, and I cannot emphasize enough how important regional organizations are, but we have to collectively hold ourselves to account for the implementation of the agenda. It's been 21 years. We have 9 years left until the aspirations of the 2030 agenda, and that really means we have to accelerate action. One of the biggest challenges that has been highlighted in this review, 20-year review of the Security Council Resolution 1325, is the dire need to finance the agenda. So I think although what is encompassed in the agenda really lays the clear roadmap, and we've seen many countries take on national action plans to implement the agenda, there is lack of financing in general to implement those actions. So there will be no action without financing. And in particular, there is very little investment in women as peace builders. So the failure to allocate these adequate and not just one-time but sustained and flexible financing is the most serious and persistent obstacle to the implementation of commitments to the Women, Peace and Security agenda. When we look at the 20-year anniversary, 86% of participating states' national action plans have minimal or even zero information on the budget allocated for financing these commitments. So I would say we can definitely, not only must do better, we can do better. And we know that although women's direct participation in peace negotiations increases the sustainability and the quality of the peace, they remain really grossly underrepresented. They remain largely excluded. And here is where I do want to touch on some numbers. I'm mindful of the time and trying to keep to the, so that I don't take up all the conversation. But I think some of the numbers I hope will be at least provocative. Between 1992 and 2018, women constituted only 13% of negotiators, 3% of mediators, and only 4% of signatories in major peace processes. And very interestingly, based on data collected in a joint effort of the European Parliament Research Service, UN Women, NATO, and others, there was a publication that came out last year, again on the 20th anniversary, looking at gender representation from EU members and the G20 across different areas, including politics, diplomacy, military, police, civil and military missions, and also business, actually. In terms of politics, women are increasingly represented in national parliaments, but we are nearly 100 years away from reaching equal representation in foreign and defense committees in those parliaments. Currently, women make up about 11% of military staff. Their numbers are increasing slowly, but if we keep the progress at the current rate, equal representation will take 325 years for the EU and a whopping 465 years for NATO. And in the same time, if we look at police forces, the average representation is 25%. It looks a little bit better because if we keep up the current progress, parity may be reached in 58 years. And we're maybe about 5 years away from achieving gender parity in leadership positions in UN peacekeeping missions, which is a plus for the UN. I mean, targets have been set. But if we look at the percentage of women among military staff of those missions, not at the leadership position, it's still really low. It's 5%, which is actually below the target of 6.5, which in my opinion is still incredibly low. The outlook for EU missions, I think, I'm sorry to say, is even worse because no woman has ever been a commander or deputy commander of a military mission, according to this data. And in terms of diplomatic corps, women on average comprise only 25% of ambassadors, while they're represented. If you look at overall diplomatic staff, the number looks a lot better. It's at 43%. But when you're looking at those senior levels as ambassadors, it's only 25. I was in a conference last week, actually, the first conference that was called Women in Foreign Policy conference, hosted by the government of North Macedonia. They've set up now a network of women in diplomacy amongst the Western Balkans 6. This is a positive trend, but let us see if this will actually have an impact in the long run. But so many of these issues were highlighted, and really, we must do better. And just before finishing, and I have a lot more to share, but I want to make sure that we're listening in to the other interventions. I just wanted to highlight there are really important entry points. It's not all a negative picture. We know that the European Union is promoting gender equality, human rights, peace and security within its strategic approach, and the EU Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. So we can look at it more carefully. We can look at it in terms of the EU approach of a holistic strategy for the implementation of this agenda, and the very strong recognition that gender equality and women's empowerment are prerequisites for achieving peace and security across the region and across the world. NATO also recognizes the importance of working on the Women, Peace and Security agenda. There is a national action plan, and as a political and military alliance, it really has incredible potential to make change happen and promote gender equality and ensure that this agenda is achieved. There's also great entry points within the UN system. I think that I mentioned before that women, peace and security is also at the heart of the 2030 agenda and of the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a cutoff date, so we really need to now think about accelerated action. That was the spirit behind the Generation Equality Initiative, and the fact that the global women's movement insisted that a global compact be established on women, peace and security and humanitarian action that was launched this year as part of the Generation Equality Forum that took place in Paris not so long ago. So I think really you have an opportunity here of bringing different stakeholders together to have this conversation about how each of us can do better and how collectively we must do better for women and girls. I'll stop here and hopefully I'll have the opportunity to add more, but thanks, and back to you, Ionela.
Thank you very much, Madam El-Yassir. You are right, and thank you for mentioning the financing part, because I also, from my reading and understanding, we can do better, but in order to do better, the governments and also the international organizations should allocate more funds in bringing more women in these peace processes, or also in promoting and training them to take the leadership positions. So I would like to move forward with Madam Charlotte Isaksson, and I will ask her what is the current phase of the implementation of the Resolution 1325 by the European Union. What are the main priorities for the EU in implementing the Women, Peace and Security agenda? And what other gender mainstreaming strategies, policies and programs does the EU created in the past years and is implementing nowadays?
Thank you very much, and thank you for also inviting to this very important session together with good colleagues in sister and brother organizations. So very happy to be here, and I concur that of course we could and will and have to do better, but at the same time we also simultaneously recognize that there have been quite remarkable achievements made. So it's not one or the other, it's actually the two at the same time. And of course, as you indicate, we have a very solid in the European Union, a solid policy framework on women, peace and security. We have conclusions from the Council. We have EU member states that are fully committed and have been also very active themselves in the sort of tailoring of the policy, which was at the time also quite, not common practice, but it was a really good exercise, which is of course good, because then it's more likely that the implementation will deliver on its objectives, because there is an ownership by the member states and everyone who is called on to implement. The Women, Peace and Security agenda is very broad, it's very complex, so that is also something we need to keep in mind. There are many things within the agenda that needs to be done. So at one point, you also need to think about resources to do that, and then not only resources for programming or for civil society and for peace builders that was mentioned, which is remarkably and very important, but also for the institutional implementation, where, of course, when we started some years ago, we started from zero. So there is also a lot of basic work to be built. And as when you build yourself a new house, the initial cost is big. And then every year you have to do, paint now and then, and to buy something like a new fridge or something. But, the initial cost is very big. And we are in no organization, we are not there yet. We are very proud of our policy framework, but at the same time, we, as everyone else, know that a policy and a plan is only valid when it is acted upon and implemented. So the phase we are in now is, of course, implementation. And this is done in multiple ways in many, many different places. One part which we are happy to present is that, of course, as now Women, Peace and Security Policy Framework is included in the sort of more comprehensive, broader policy framework on gender equality and women's empowerment in the European Union, it's also more than before a natural part of the programming, which our colleagues in the Commission are in charge of and doing as we speak. And as you know, the European Union is I would say, the contributor to global programming on gender equality and women's empowerment and women's rights. So of course, this is a very good thing. But of course, for us, it was also important to connect dots, because we saw a little bit of too big fragmentation, both sort of organizational fragmentation and thematic fragmentation within an area which is more or less interrelated. And this is why, as also was mentioned by the previous speaker, gender equality is really at the core of our Women, Peace and Security policy framework. And this is this was a little bit of a new feature when the strategic approach was launched, but Women, Peace and Security again is coming. One could say, it's not what, depending on who you ask, you will have, of course, different answers. But I would say that the objectives of Women, Peace and Security are peace, security, and gender equality. So all three of them. And just because you have peace, you might not have security. And while you have security, you might not have gender equality. So it's not one or the other. All of them are equally important. And then, of course, in the Women, Peace and Security Policy Framework, and also then in Gender Action Plan 3, because now they are like hand in glove, as you know. We have, of course, that I mentioned programming. That's, of course, a big part. We have thematic objectives. I will not go through them, but I would rather speak about that we, of course, have gender balance and women's representation, women's leadership and meaningful participation as a key objective. But another equally important key objective is gender mainstreaming. And we also need to remember that gender balance or more women does not necessarily equal gender equality or gender mainstreaming, for that matter, because gender mainstreaming is a competence. That is something you learn and do. And just because you are born a woman, that's not necessarily something that comes only with that. So in that regard, of course, in male-dominated contexts, we are quite optimistic still. And the third thing, besides gender balance and gender mainstreaming, which comes from the Beijing platform, and you all know that as the key strategies to achieve gender equality, we also introduced both in the Women, Peace and Security Action Plan and in the Gender Action Plan, the new requirement of a gender responsive leadership. Because as long as we do not have a gender responsive leadership in place, people like us and me, we can do whatever magical things we think we are doing, but you know, the leadership must be leading on this as everything else, and the managers need to manage this. And here we are convinced, and we also see that the leadership commitment is really the thing that makes us break through. So we are very, very optimistic. We do think we have much still to do, things that we could do better. But the very good thing is that we have identified what we need to do better, and we also have a fairly good idea about how to do it and who should do it. And we also are very clear on the fact that this is not something we can do alone. We have to do all of this together with our close allies and partners and friends, both from multilateral and global settings, international and regional organizations, bilateral partners, of course, too, and not at least civil society partners, women peace builders. And finally, I also want to mention, because it's also a very big part of the work we are actually doing in the implementation as we speak on women, peace and security, the work with mediators, mediation, both what we could call a gender responsive mediation, which is again a competence and could and should be done by both men and women, but also as an objective in itself to ensure that we have many more, much more active women mediators in all types of peace negotiations and mediating processes. So yeah, we are very optimistic, and I also want to thank, because I think this discussion today is really contributing to this effort of ours. Thank you.
Thank you as well, and I'm happy to hear about the gender responsible leadership point that you mentioned. I also feel that it's important not only for the European Union, but also for the other institutions, and even for the states, especially for the states, to implement this gender responsible leadership within their national action plans, and also to transmit that from the public sector to the private sector, because we also have to keep in mind that the private sector is very important also in these discussions. So now I would like to move forward to hear more about the perspective of NATO. And I would like to give the floor to Lieutenant Colonel Diana Morais, and I would ask her how it's the Women, Peace and Security agenda approach by NATO, what gender-focused strategies, programs, and policies does the Alliance implement these days? And then afterwards, I would like to have another round of questions, but moving a little bit more on the personal side, because you as a woman have a lot of experience, and I would like to hear more about that personal experience.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Ionela. Good morning to you all. Good afternoon. It's also a pleasure to be here and to be discussing this topic. I will try to address the first questions you've made, Ionela, and then maybe in the second round, I will talk about my personal experience as you've asked me. And I would start for that really good question that you have in the title of this dialogue, which is, what can we do better? This is an excellent way to address this topic, since it simultaneously recognizes our failures and our collective will to perform better. And in fact, as NATO enters the 8th decade of its existence, it stands as history's most successful alliance. Yet future uncertainties call for NATO's continuous adaptation. Today, the alliance is facing a wider variety of looming challenges than its founders could have foreseen when they signed the Washington Treaty in April 1949. And at the last summit, NATO leaders endorsed the NATO 2030 agenda, to, as you mentioned in our introduction, to make sure the alliance remains ready, strong, and united for a new era of increased global competition. And in this future, where does women, peace and security stand? And I would like to focus my reflection and my thoughts on this. And my first reflection concerns the need to assess the impact that the new global geopolitical dynamic brings upon security and defense. Because over the last decades, conflict has become profoundly marked by transnational terrorism and violent radicalization, as well as the return of territorial annexation and contested sovereignty in disputed territories, often resorting to hybrid warfare. All of this is taking place at the dawn of renewed geopolitical competition among leading world powers with potentially hostile actors. What this complex scenario suggests is that the preparation of the military increasingly combines training for war and training for building peace, because they are different expressions of the complex social realities that we must deal with. I would also mention the strong technological competition that has already changed the way of conducting war and that is changing our societies. Addressing these challenges and ensuring a safe and secure environment requires a strong, committed, and resilient NATO that continues to reaffirm its unity, solidarity, and cohesion. So my second reflection, it's about the role of women in peace and security. As the Security Council Resolution 3025 has recognized, the terrain of war and peace is not gender neutral. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda has provided us the tools to transform peace building by bringing women into the processes. Instead of relying only on the usual instigations of conflicts to create peace, a more diverse participation, including of women, often disrupts the status quo that generates the conflict in the first place by establishing a more inclusive vision of peace. In addition, although women and girls are the main, but not the only victims of violence and discrimination related to conflict, they may also play a different role, namely being agents of insecurity itself. Hence, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda has also changed the way we plan and execute our operations and missions, making them more suited to the realities of the societies we seek to protect. Adjusting our education, training and exercises, capabilities development, and our force composition to this reality does not make our missions less effective. It makes them more effective because they are tailored to achieve their final goal, which is achieving sustainable peace. Yet, women remain underrepresented in all peace and security processes, and the discussion about increasing the participation of female peacekeepers has been going on for more than 2 decades, as the other two panelists mentioned, without having reached the expected and desired progress. Well, this brings me to my third and last reflection, which is how can NATO engage and leverage the participation of women in peace and security? Participation is a right of every woman. We need direct, substantive, and diverse inclusion of women so they can influence the execution and outcome of all aspects related to peace and security. NATO has been implementing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda for a long time now. In fact, the first policy on women, peace and security was approved back in 2007. During this period, the Alliance has worked to incorporate the gender perspective of security, including operational, moral, political, and legal considerations into all NATO activities. By considering that threats and challenges to security can have different impact on men and women due to their gender, strategies and policies can serve to identify and give political momentum to the adoption of actions that are necessary to develop more effective solutions that will definitely sustain the necessary change. This is a reality we should not ignore, and NATO strategic documents and policies cannot be gender blind. Gender perspective must be coherently integrated throughout the development process, so it doesn't become a mere declaration of principles which falls short in its implementation. So, as NATO is currently discussing its future, a new strategic concept that will set the strategic direction for its political and military adaptation, it must renew itself. Gender equality has a considerable role to play in this regard, not only because it matters for the way in which NATO as a collective security institution operates, but also for how it shapes itself as a democratic institution. The centrality of gender equality in ensuring a ready and responsive NATO is also undeniable. Ensuring that women are relevant is not just about increasing their representation, but about promoting their substantive and meaningful participation. That is why I think NATO should envision a strategic concept that pledges and leverages gender equality, moving from the commonly accepted add-on gender perspective and women, peace and security agenda to challenging the alliance and its biases and assumptions on how security is made. This is, in my opinion, the only way to ensure coherence and sustainability of our results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your valuable input. And I saw that we already started to have questions in our Q&A, and I would like to start to address them. But firstly, I would like to go around and ask you about your personal experience as women working in a highly male-dominated environment. So what lessons can you draw from your experience as a woman working in a highly male environment, and especially in the military?
Okay, Ionela, well, I will, that is really a personal question, and I will give you my personal experience that I don't believe is the same for every woman in the military. It's true that the military, as other organizations are, it's still a male-dominated institution, though I believe we have really made some very good progress. And for instance, in my country, Portugal, we have been having women in the military since the beginning of the 90s, which is more than 30 years. And when I joined the military in the beginning, actually it was in 1996, a long time ago, I felt that maybe the institution at the beginning was still not used to having women in the military, but that quickly we really fast we found our way, and the institution and mainly our colleagues accepted us. What still I would like to say is that the military is a very hierarchical organization, and that likes to think in a universal, I would call it universal soldier. It doesn't matter if it's a woman, it's a man, but it has an idea of a universal soldier. And not everyone fits this image of a universal soldier. And in that sense, you have to choose your own path. Either you want to have an easier, I would say an easier task and adapt to that universal image of a soldier, or you want to be yourself. And that, I think, it's the most difficult to me, my personal perspective, since I didn't felt like that universal, fitting to that universal image of a soldier. And then you have to struggle, you have to prove yourself, you have to, but I think it's the same for every woman in any organization, male dominated. You have to prove yourself, you have to prove you are competent, you have to prove you are valuable, you have to show your skills, never fail, which is almost impossible because I'm not a superwoman and we don't have super women. But sometimes it's still like that. And maybe I know there is still work to do. And much of that comes about changing the culture. and the mindset. But that is something that really takes time, that we need a lot of education and training, and also we need to have more women, because although numbers are not the only thing that matters, they are at the same time they are important, because we have to have more women, to even for younger women, and this is really important, to understand that they can be whatever they want. If they want to be in the military, they can be. If they want to be in police, they can be whatever they want. But they can only acknowledge that if they have role models where they can support their decisions. So instead, we change.
I have another question for you, based on what you mentioned. Does the fact that there are more women now members of the military armed forces, does it contribute to the humanization of the warfare?
Well, in my opinion, personal opinion, no, because not all women are sensitive and more human. So it is up to the person. We cannot say that puts all the women in the same place and all the men in the same group, because we are people. Each one of us is different, and we cannot stereotype. For me, that's to be honest, it's a really big mistake, saying that women, when they go to mission, military women, it's more easier for them to talk to the local population, to engage, to understand, so that is a typical stereotype. And like Charlotte mentioned, not all, we have to be trained, educated and trained to have that kind of performance if we want to make our missions effective and really engage with the population. This is not something that women are born with. This is skills. Some people might have it, but still you have to train them. And that is not related to being women, because to be honest, I know many women that are not sensitive at all. So you cannot make that kind of assumption, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to move forward to Madam Isaksson. I would like to ask you about the financing part, because we received the question from the audience. It's in the new neighborhood development and international cooperation instrument, what funding is specifically dedicated to gender programming in crisis and fragility context? This was one of the questions, and in particular in regards to the women, peace and security agenda.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, so as you probably know, in the GAP, in the Gender Action Plan 3, there is a target of 85% of EU-funded actions should be gender responsive, and at least one of those targeted actions with gender should have gender equality and women's empowerment as a principal objective in each country. So this is a target. So you can hear here that we speak about gender responsive, gender equality and women's empowerment, but then you have to remember what I said before, that for us, women, peace and security are very present in those terms I just mentioned. So of course, in the end of the day, that will be up to the colleagues working on our end on the geographical side, together with, for example, the EU delegation, to identify what programs should be established and implemented. And one very good thing we think is that with GAP3, we have been able to synchronize the multi-annual indicative program and the country level implementation plans, which is, in short, it's a sort of way for each country level, each EU delegation together with member states in place to operationalize GAP3 into their specific local country-specific context. And as the multi-annual indicative programs plans and the CLIPs have been developed simultaneously, those processes has of course been mutually informing each other. So I think it was in late July, but I know that we gave, some of the colleagues out there asked for extension, but in late July, we were asking to get back all the clips and the MIPs. Sorry for the language here. But so far, our first assessment of the MIPs, the plans for the multi-annual indicative program, is that it seems to be, from a gender point of view, a more satisfactory progress and result compared to the MIPs in the previous MFF. So we are very, on this point too, very optimistic. But again, all of this, exactly what will be tailored in line with what people would call the more general women, peace and security framework, that's really up to the analysis that is made in country by the colleagues who are there working in country together with all present stakeholders, both from the EU side, hopefully at least, and also stakeholders and partners, local government authorities, civil society, etc., etc. So I don't know the outcome yet of this, but this is where we are, and we do believe strongly that we have built a procedure and a process that is very, again, promising. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to add a question to Ms. El-Yassir. How would you advise on implementing the agenda in readiness, preparing the military forces? What could a military branch do to improve in terms of education and training? I know that you also have experience in this educational sector.
Okay, a few reflections. I think this is really important. I think it is incredibly important to invest in human beings. And I think, you need to look at two levels, right? If we're looking at gender equality as the heart or the driver, and I think that's the common element in the interventions, that we really focus on gender equality as being critical, a goal in and of itself, but also a means to an end. So I think we need to focus on that. We need to look at the enabling environment. So we do need to look at structures, and we also need to look at agency, so the power of individuals. So you cannot do one without the other. You do have to look at both and invest adequately in both. So you do need to invest in human capital, because the system, however great your systems are, if you don't invest in the human capital, the change is not going to happen. And if you only invest in the human capital without creating an enabling environment, it's not going to work. So what we've seen as bringing about positive change is that dual approach. Right? So where you are not just focusing on capacity development training without addressing structural barriers, right? And you can't just work on the structural barriers without creating also the buy-in from those who are going to be implementing on behalf of the system. So I think they have to go hand in hand, and you have to always be linking the two. And I really do think that I cannot emphasize enough investment, and looking at investment as part of an overall. So I think, targets like we've heard from Charlotte in terms of, these clear targets in the gap, and then there has to be an accountability mechanism and a way to measure that. I would say the same goes for any intervention where you're making an investment in a training of any sort. Where's the impact of that training? Is it that people are getting frustrated down the line, or it's not leading to any positive change, or they face roadblocks, so that it becomes a feedback mechanism so it can improve. So it's not a standalone activity. I think, gender, I'm always put in this position because I'm always an advocate for gender equality, and people want a simple answer. It's absolutely impossible. It's a complex issue, and there will never be a simple answer for a complex issue. And it's not that one entity or one country or one, a person has a magic solution, because context shifts also over time. and whoever is involved. So you constantly need to have a mechanism actually that brings everybody together to figure it out, and figure out when things are not working. Because I think too many times you've seen one thing, like training can work in one context and may not be the most effective solution in another because you haven't tackled another issue. So I think that would be my answer to that question. And can I have a couple of reflections on what has been said? Is that, or would you prefer to go for a final round? It's fine.
Yes, we'll have like a final round of questions, and then if you do have some reflection at the end, we'll have this opportunity.
Okay.
I would like to ask you, because I know that I already asked Lieutenant Morais about her personal experience working in the highly male-dominated field. So I would like to ask you and Mr. Isaksson about your experience as women in like women who are basically cutting the how they are saying, the glass ceiling in this mainly dominating field.
Shall I start? And then, okay, thank you. Actually, yeah, that was what I wanted to comment on, so it's perfect. And the thing that, because I've been in the UN system for over 25 years. So basically, I came into the system when the last World Conference on Women was happening, and there was a lot of euphoria around the world amongst everybody. And so I was very optimistic coming into the system, and I did face a lot of roadblocks because I really felt that it was very difficult to push the agenda within a system which is a bureaucracy. I mean, it also has a hierarchy. I mean, it's the United Nations. Let's not fool ourselves. In any kind of institution like this, you will face bureaucracy, and which recreate whatever social norms exist. So, you know, like it has higher aspirations. I think what the UN has done is kind of set the normative standards, but it takes a long time. What has turning points for me, if I look at the moment now, how important it is that we have a Secretary General that defines himself as a feminist, and how that has shifted. I would not have imagined that 26 years ago, and how radical that is, that we're bringing the term feminist back into the mainstream where it was really taken off the agenda. And you know, I told you about the conference I was at last week, and linking to a point you said before, there was a whole discourse when we're talking about women in foreign policy. There was a clear sort of dichotomy between a feminist foreign policy, which questions systems altogether, versus, you know, this feminine foreign policy where, you know, you need more women because they're better peacemakers, etc. And I think that connects with what the Lieutenant Colonel was talking about. So I think for me, that to see feminism come back into the mainstream has been hugely effective. And also that the UN system, whereas 26 years ago, I was being told, no, you can't talk about gender equality when it comes to politics or when it comes to humanitarian action, relief and recovery. That's a development issue. It does not sit in this field. That has really shifted. We still get the resistance, but you're now seeing that no, gender equality is at the heart of all of these agenda, and actually gender equality is a political issue, which feminists have been saying for years. So now is coming into the mainstream. So I feel like my takeaway is, you know, when you're the only person with that voice, you feel very outnumbered in a room that's dominated by this discourse, this very patriarchal discourse that manifests in every meeting room, wherever it is. But I think you really need those high-level leaders to come out and say, no, we want to do things a little bit differently and question the system itself. And I'll stop there. But thank you very much for a provocative question.
Thank you. Mrs. Isaksson, would you like to go further?
Yeah, no, I can also answer to that personal question, perhaps. Being also older than Diana, So I joined my army unit long time ago, and of course things were very different then. And I think this is what I want to share with you, that the way things were, that's not how they are today. So this is also why I remain very optimistic. And for example, my son, he was doing his basic military training last year in the Army Ranger unit, and after a couple of weeks he came home and he said, "Oh, Mama, the best officer among all of them in the whole regiment is this female officer." And for sure, that wouldn't have happened in the 90s when I was in the army. So I think what we face now is a lot of positive change, where people probably see less gender and more sort of the actual skill and ability and the personality of the person, no matter if it is a diplomat or an officer or a soldier or whatever. And I'm very optimistic in that regard, because also in Sweden we see very big growth in the number of women, and of course this plays to that. And I also want to really echo what was said on, we have to really, and this is really where I think we all, even on a personal basis, and including myself, where we could and must do better, is to help each other to get rid of those gender stereotypes, because they are really blocking a lot of positive progress, not only for women, but also for men. So there are both, and then I speak about both what one could perhaps call positive stereotypes that will affect you positively, while that is not related to facts or truth. And there are also, of course, negative stereotypes, and both positive and negative are really bad. And for security, we see clearly that sort of the positive stereotype around women, that they are nicer, friendlier, and more peaceful, is actually adding to our own insecurity. So this is not, saying that we have to combat stereotypes. It's not a nice thing to say. It's actually hard security fact that we need to address now. So we should help each other and remind each other, because we all fall in that trap now and then.
Thank you very much. As we are moving closer to the conclusion of this event, I would like to ask Colonel Morais to answer to our last question that we received in the Q&A session. So what are the most striking successes that you have identified in which relates to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and what are some of the lessons that we can draw from the engagement, and what priorities do you identify for the future?
Okay, thank you for that question. I really think that we've made progress in these 21 years. I don't believe that in the current situation, if you talk about women, peace and security, everyone knows what we are talking about. I believe that, and that was because NATO and the nations made quite an effort in education and training. And I also strongly believe that we have the support of our leadership. And that was already mentioned, at least at the highest level, I believe we have the support of the leadership. And that is really important to move this agenda forward. What I think the shift that needs to be done is that we are still relying in some people, and we are relying on the leadership, we are relying on the specialists, the subject matter experts. And like all my colleagues mentioned, this is something that has to be enshrined in in everything that we do. And it has to be something that every one of us, as a person, as a professional, has to contribute to. And so this is the shift. It's a difficult shift, and I really love the perspective of the feminist policies. This is, to me, my goal. It's a difficult one, but I think we will get there. That will allow us this shift. this is something in the way. So everything that you do, and if we are talking about NATO, so everything that NATO does has to contribute to promoting gender equality. When we achieve this, we will have will be succeeded, and this is to achieve this. Like I've mentioned when I talk to, this has to be embodied in our main strategies, policies, but then it has to be something. It's not an add-on, and we cannot only have. We already have a WPS policy and action plan. We have some directives, but it has to be our defense policy, NATO defense policy, not the WPS policy. NATO defense policy has to promote gender equality. And this is, I would say, my key takeaway, and what I believe it's the key for success.
Thank you very much for your input. If you have a brief takeaway from the event now, you have the chance to express it like in 1 or 2 minutes briefly, because we are moving closer to the end of our session.
Well, I think the only thing I can add to this is I have to congratulate you for this initiative, because I think this type of debate, it's essential to help our high-level decision makers to make decisions, consistent decisions based on analysis and debate. So keep up with this really good work, and thank you for inviting me to this really important event.
Thank you for agreeing to come with us and expressing your views today. For our other panelists, Madam El-Yassir, Madam Isaksson, if you have like a final comment, now is the opportunity to share with us.
No, I echo Diana saying that this is exactly the type of discussions that we need to continue to have. So thank you so much for that. And my only takeaway, and what I want to really emphasize, is that change is possible. It is really possible. It is not impossible, and obstacles can be overcome. And we have seen it so many times. And if somebody would have told me 15 years ago that we would be at the point we are now, I wouldn't have believed my ears. And this is something I try to remind myself about now and then, because it is possible. And if you can, send people to, I don't know, whatever planets people with money are traveling nowadays, if you can do that, of course you can achieve gender equality and also ensure that violence against men, women, boys and girls are ended.
Thank you. Just to add, and many thanks to the other panelists, and thank you for this event. It has provoked a lot of thinking. I'll be going away and thinking through some of the issues. I guess the final word is just accountability, really, and that's why I do come back to numbers. They are important because, we treasure what we measure. And if we want to look at whether we're following up on our commitments, we have to follow the money. Where is the money going and what's it going to? Because that tells us what priorities are. And if we've learned anything from COVID-19 is that although we know gender equality is a means to an end, not just an end to itself, we see it constantly underfunded. So I really think it's great to set targets, but let's hold ourselves to account for those targets. And we can only do this working together. And it's been a wonderful experience to hear the other panelists as well. You've provoked my thinking, and I'll be doing some follow-up. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. I would like to thank you, our brilliant panelists, for your important input and for agreeing to be with us this morning. I certainly will leave this session much wiser and better equipped to understand the complexity of the women in peace and security agenda. And I would like to thank our audience for joining us today and putting forward such interesting questions. I wish you all a good afternoon, and keep following EPC online, because we are preparing many more interesting events in the upcoming days and weeks. Have a lovely day, everyone, and keeping in touch online.